Panel is ready. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the main problem we see with selling lands to foreign like corporations and institutions and states or whatever is a never-ending cycle that starts. At the point where you don't have enough land anymore that you can use yourself effectively, you just need to rely always on the short-term benefit, on the short-term gain you get from selling. All you are left with is just to always sell new pieces of land, but this never actually provides you any long-term gain. You never actually gain interdependence. You always have to rely on others. You always just gain these short-term benefits. We think this is the main problem in this debate. Okay, there will be two main things in the speech panel. First, I'm going to give you some key characterizations and the frame for our side of the house. Then my argument on exploitation and also the drastic impacts this brings with it, which is why this motion should be approved. Okay, first of all, in this debate, we believe that the short-term benefit from like selling, for example, may exist, but long-term problems from selling need to be acknowledged and are what will actually harm the country the most. Let's start off with some characterizations. First of all, on developing countries. They comparatively have weaker economies, they'll have less leverage in international relations because they're to other countries comparatively poor because they just haven't been building that much yet, they're still developing. What do we think are their main interests? First of all, they want to gain in standing on the global stage, they want to improve their economy, entirely just development and things like infrastructure, social systems as well. Now, second characterization on foreign corporations and states. What do we think they will do? They obviously have an incentive to maximize profits. They want little costs, but lots of revenue. And they don't have an incentive to care about the local community, about the local country where they own land in, because it's not their land. And then what we think the main thing they're going to do is, there are three main possibilities we see here. Either they export from there, they resell crops at higher prices, or they do something else, which we think are things like building factories. And now, we do think this is going to be part of the motion, because the motion reads, arable land can be used for crops, but it doesn't have to. So we think that obviously, because foreign corporations or states always has incentive to maximize profit, there's possibilities they don't just use things for crops, there's the possibility that they use it for other things like factories, and this is also going to provide even more harm. Now finally, on foreign corporations and states, they also have more economic and political leverage because they have a bigger economy, they have more money, and therefore can pay lower prices because they're going to create deals in favor of them. Why do we think then developing countries will agree to deals that don't favor them as much? Because they're just relatively desperate, because they want this short-term gain they get so dependent on. And then now, a third characterization, why do we think prohibiting is necessary? We think that currently selling, because of desperation for short-term gain, is the easy way out of the cake, but they're never actually being pushed to reduce dependence and to actually start doing things by themselves. And we think that once prohibited, that the forced incentive to increase agriculture and reduce dependence happens. Now finally, last characterization on citizens, I'll take you in a second. They're generally interested in further development, they want high income, and they want to live stable and feasible life. But before I move on, I'll take you away.
Note how these countries might have the incentive to invest in their own agriculture, but they do not have the capacity. This is why they need higher powers to give them infrastructure, to give them things. How do you improve on your side of the house, and why are then the short-term impacts that we achieve bad?
The problem we see on your side of the house, is also going to be on my main argument, is the main factor of exploitation and what I mentioned earlier. The thing is, corporations never have corporations don't care about what they do. They use pesticides, they build factories, they pollute, they don't care if they do this in the field of the developing countries. This means, on our side, there's always going to, there's a chance it's going to stay for them to actually further increase development, while on opposition side of the house, on opposition side of the house, developing is never going to be possible because they're stuck in an infinite cycle of selling and dependence. Now finally, in this debate, there are two main things we're going to prove to you, panel. First, how selling land reduces the developing chances for developing countries, and then secondly, why it's necessary to prohibit, considering things like the political situation. Okay, now enough of that, let me get on to my argument on exploitation. First of all, just some short definition, what is exploitation? What do we think it is? It's for example, these corporations who are of higher standing taking advantage of the desperate developing countries, and this all being at detrimental harm of disadvantage. Okay, that's clear. Now let's start off with the mechanisms. First mechanism: what incentive do these foreign corporations and states have to exploit? Well, we think that foreign corporations or states are just generally based on profits. their goals are to maximize profit in the most efficient and cheap way possible. And they don't like care if they harm, for example, the developing country in the process, because it's not their country, it's not where they live. They just care about ensuring that they get the best possible outcome. Now, they also see the desperation of developing countries, because countries are likely to agree to deals, for example, that benefit the corporations or states more because they want the short-term benefit. No, thank you. They want to ensure that they can get this money. They think it's going to be good for the economy, but in reality, they just get stuck in this loop. And then corporations or states, we think they're likely to buy from them because they can get this advantage because of the desperation they see. This is like their main incentive. Now, second of all, why do they have the capacity to exploit? Because they generally have like more money or like more funding. Because they're like you're not going to be buying land if you don't have the available resources for it. And at the point where you're like a developing country, you're not going to buy countries from other land. So we think we think that the foreign corporations who actually buy land are generally going to have enough money to fund this. And then we also think that corporations interested like in buying land will have funds available, because at the point where they like feel it's smart to buy the land they likely will have the money to do this. And plus, because they have more money, they're also going to have more leverage, and because of this focus because of how they focus on desperation of developing countries, they can get themselves a better deal. Now, third mechanisms, how do we see them exploiting? Things are like, money doesn't, no thank you, money isn't going to go to locals and like profits stay entirely theirs, but then they also like actively focus on the vulnerability. They actively focus on like the people being poor, they focus on that's developing countries, they focus on the desperation that stays, and use it to entirely get the best gain possible that they can get for themselves. And they can do it because they're just taking advantage of the situation. Now, we think there are like a few things that they do that are harmful. First of all, things like using pesticides for profits. If they actually use the land for a crop, they will use pesticides because they just want the best short-term gain, and it's at the point where the land is worn out and unusable, they just leave developing countries with unusable land. Now, what do we thank you. What do we think are the main impact on the economy? So entirely the main impact are the economy is harmed. The economy harm exceeds the economy growth they get through selling their country. Entirely, as I already mentioned in my intro, it stops future development availability for developing countries. Because at the point where they once start selling, they just can't stop because there's too less like land available to do anything. So they're relying on this short-term economic gain from selling, can't export, can't import, or they're stuck in this infinite cycle, and like their economy on the long term will never improve. Always just this short-term gain. And why do we think it's likely for companies also to use land for things like factories rather than crops? Because the main things they do are either sell back at a higher price, or they export, or they build factories. And we think like when they want to sell crops back or export crops, they're going to use pesticides, which is bad, and land quality worsens. But we think it's likely for them to use factories instead of things like crops because they're focusing on profit. And with factories, they can drive in more profit because they can get lots of workers who, because of desperation and because of like need for money, will still work at minimum wage and things like that. And they can also entirely with factories produce things that are worth more when exported. So we think this is more likely that they use this. So finally, on the people, they just get stuck in a country that never improves. Their quality worsens more and more and more. And like on our side of the house, they don't have this dependence. They're pushed to actually focus on becoming independent and being able to focus on their economy by themselves. For all those reasons, I'm so proud to propose. Thank you for listening.
So if this was a never-ending cycle, and if countries would just magically, if the countries would be able to just magically improve their economy, they would do it, right? I think that's pretty obvious. Now I will start with some negations, and then I will go to some clarifications, which I think are deeply needed, and then I will go to my first two arguments, which is first argument, principle of choice, and second argument, foreign investments, right? So firstly, the side of the proposition is trying to tell you that it is bad for people to have jobs, it is bad for them to work, and so on, right? Well, these foreign investors, right, and I will talk about it in my second argument, but just shortly, this is the only thing they have left. This is the last thing for some international relations, because they are insufficient. These developing countries are insufficient. They cannot just, the side of the proposition doesn't give you one single mechanism how they are going to improve their economy, right? Because the government wouldn't sell this land if they cannot do something on that, right? They are selling that land because they cannot do anything on it. And then the second argument, which is like exploitation. Firstly, there is like huge international overlook. Again, it will be mentioned in my second argument. But also, if you use pesticides, most countries won't buy from you because of these regulations. Please mind that we are like in a modern world. And if they would just leave, and also they had that point that these investors will just leave, well, please mind that that wouldn't be good for the investors because they would just have to buy even more land, and that land is not like, you know, not really that cheap, and it's not just sure gain. Also, they mentioned, no thank you, also they mentioned the factories, right, that they will put factories on arable land. Please, the motion says on arable land, right? And they will, these investors will just build factories on non-arable land because it's cheaper, and that's not the part of this debate. So just a quick clarification. Now, moving to my first argument, which is principle of choice. Now, we believe that every country under international law has the right to do whatever they want through the freedom of choice. So why does this, no thank you, not right now. They say, so why does this principle even exist? It consists of three main mechanisms, right? Because I know what's the best for me. I am the government on the ground. I see the problems that my people have, therefore I know how to take care of myself and of my people. Secondly, it is principally I am the only one who takes care of myself. Like, it is my actions that take care of my country. It is the agreements I make, it is the unions I sign that ensure the well-being of my country, right? If my people won't have the water, I will be the one to know that they don't have water. And thirdly, I am the one who suffers the consequences of my action. If I choose to sell my land, I am the one who will either enjoy or suffer my consequences is me. Now, how does the just a second. Okay. And this means that countries will have. This means that countries have that right to autonomy, which is principally, as I just explained. Okay. And it is also the UN protected right. This autonomy. Please.
The right of autonomy adds no further value to the debate. The motion states this as
please. I will just go further on. This is like, okay, so how does proposition infringe this principle? They take this choice away from the government and the people in the country. However, this prohibition is going to be done international, like for some communities, and that is not good because that country doesn't have veto power like they're like big countries like USA and so on, and their voice doesn't really matter. They do not have a say in this. And what is most likely to happen, this developing country will have to connect with like ex-colonialists, and they will only have from the past as in the roads. And this principle is only amplified by the fact that the countries should be the ones to help them. These countries should be the ones to help them, not just limit them, right? And why is this principle important? Because without freedom of choice, you cannot do good decisions for your country. Nobody knows better for your country than you do, and nobody should have a say. Now our second argument, no thank you. Now our second argument, which is foreign investors, and I think this is really crucial for the debate for you panel to realize that restricting foreign countries and corporations will cancel foreign investments, right? And why are foreign investments even good? Because firstly, efficiency, right? We are talking about acres of land that is really big amount of arable land. And for this to be efficient, for this to even produce a good enough amount of food for the people there, it needs power supply, it needs canals for the water, and so on. And developing countries just simply do not consume that much capital to be able to make this land work, right? They don't even have enough capital to produce, and they won't, the side of the proposition wants to tell you, they won't just magically get that capital. It's impossible. Please mind that. Now, what does happen with foreign capital? No, thank you. They will bring technology. They will bring like more water if necessary, more production, and this will open new jobs for domestic people. Now, we understand that like a part of the higher jobs will probably be filled, but I don't know if British are there. But still, some kind. They will have to educate these people, and to some level, the people will benefit from it. And also very important point that they will need these workers, they will need these people, and that means that it's like in the foreign investors' best interest to keep the workers at least to some extent healthy, at least to some extent like, no thank you, at least to some extent do they have food, because again they need these workers to work, right? And also this might incentivize so that they, I don't know, might build roads, right, for them to, they will build infrastructure, they will build hospitals, because it will make these foreign investment jobs easier, right? But this also hugely affects the people there, right? For example, in Canada, they like built a whole city there because and that good impacts went to the people there, right? Not like just the foreign investments. Also, mind that not every country is like Congo, and not every country has like these rich resources like that are good for mining, for example, right? Because Congo, okay, maybe has a lot of resources and they can mine there, and it is like interesting, but that is not the case for all countries. And again, they cannot magically just claim that they will have like some magic system that will produce so much food. And these developing countries, they only have arable land, right? And they cannot even use their land to feed their own people. Please mind that it's hard to like manifest products from this land, because it's not like you just seed something. It needs more like thingies around that. And also the impacts, people will at least have some kind of jobs. They will at least have some kind of security. They are not hungry because investors have the incentive to keep them not hungry, and it acres the extent they will get roads, so on. Thank you.
Where opposition is currently losing this debate is fundamentally mischaracterizing developing countries, and today I'll be reconstructing our case, first going over strategic notes, reconstructing our case, and finally providing an extension argument on how on the improvement of political situations. So first of all, with a few strategic notes, what has opposition told us? Opposition has told us that building factories is outside of the scope of the debate. First of all, this is simply not factual, as the motion states that lands can be used for crops, so it doesn't have to, and additionally, they provide the mechanism that because non-arable land will be cheaper, that these foreign companies will only use non-arable land for factories. However, simultaneously, they tell us just now in their speech that, quote, they only have arable land. These developing countries are plenty in arable land, and therefore, a lot of the time, the foreign investors can see that there will be more of a profit if they use this land for other purposes. We believe that this clarifies what has been brought up so far. Additionally, autonomy is irrelevant in the debate, as it is a motion of the House believes that. Now going into some quick reconstruction while addressing the key clashes and points of contention in this debate so far. First of all is a reconstruction on exploitation. So the opposition tells us that investors will not leave the state of the land, they will not leave the state of the land once it becomes unusable. So what we have provided is we have provided mechanization about how these investors, because they are driven by profit, they have no incentive to make the land sustainable, to make the land be able to provide lasting benefit for the local community, and therefore, once the land is used up, that they no longer see a profit that can come from this land, they're incentivized to leave. We believe that the opposition has not provided significant counter mechanism, nor directly engaged with the mechanisms that we have actually presented. Additionally, we have presented numerous mechanisms within this argument that they have simply not addressed. Now on to the point of employment. So the opposition tells us that the employment, not at this moment, the opposition tells us that the only employment that these developing countries get is from these foreign investors, and this is why it is crucial. However, we tell you that one, these foreign companies are incentivized to underpay local workers, and B, these foreign companies are incentivized to hire imported workers from other nations and to not actually employ the local community. Now, why is this? It is again the reason of profit. And why do they have the capacity to do this as well? When the foreign corporations own the land in the developing country, they have control over it, and they have control over their own company's runnings, and therefore if they see that a local is willing to accept a lower wage, which they are willing to do most of the time in developing countries, then they will drive to push these wages as low as possible. Now, why is this different on our side of the house, and why would it be different if the land is owned by a local company rather than a foreign one? This is because the local company has a higher stake in the developing country. They are more incentivized to actually care about the local community, and they face more pressure to do so. In a second, why do they face this pressure? It is because they face it from the government and they face it from society. For example, if they do not do so, they may face public backlash, and therefore people consume their products less. Yes?
Even if your incentive analysis that you just presented stands, where do they have the capacity? Where do they get the money to pay the locals properly, and where do they get the money to even build the infrastructure in the first place?
We believe that they get this, we believe that the reason why they currently lack the money to do these things is because of their dependence on foreign actors. This is the status quo. They are being exploited within the status quo, and this is exactly why our first argument stands. This is exactly why our entire case stands. The reason why they currently lack this money is because of exploitation, is because of decades of colonialism, and only on our side of the house do we actually create change that breaks this cycle and allows them to, in the future, have this capacity. And this directly addresses the next point that I was going to talk about, which is about capacity. We'd also like so now we have provided a counter-analysis panel. We have provided the analysis that because of too much foreign control and because of these because of decades of colonialism, where foreign owners have this has led to the current state. And additionally, an additional counter-analysis for this is about corrupt leaders that have no incentive to improve infrastructure. And within the extension on our case that I will present, this point will be addressed, and I will prove why we change the incentive of corrupt leaders, and which will lead to an improvement in infrastructure that is unique to our side of the house. Before I do so, let's address the point of autonomy. So they say that the government deserves the right to choose. However, what opposition is basically saying is that if millions of citizens suffer under poor systems, we should simply let them do this because of autonomy. Autonomy itself is outside of the scope of debate, but let's say that it is, right? Developing countries suffer from dependence from foreign actors, and these foreign actors are able to influence the local politics, and that this already means that in the world today, developing countries are more dependent on other nations and therefore already deal with less sovereignty. This is not unique to our side of the house. And finally, with foreign investment, we tell you that foreign investment depends on domestic strength and does not exist solely through selling land. Why is this? Investors want profit. Where do they see profit? In stable infrastructure. And additionally, selling land does not equate to investment because money will only go into foreign avenues. And now now that this has been covered, I would like to move into my extension argument, which is about the improvement of the political situation. Two mechs here. Mech 1 is corruption. I will prove 1, corruption is widespread in developing countries. 2, why this leads to land sale and harm. And 3, why we mitigate this. And finally, why does this matter? First of all, why is corruption widespread in developing countries? This is because of decades of colonialism, which has left these countries in shambles without a political system in place. And when there's no structured political system, corrupt leaders are then able to come to power and stay in power because of authoritarianism, because they're able to use the military, for example, to control the population. This is why we see, for example, in Venezuela and Bolivia, there's widespread corruption. This applies to most of South America and Africa. So 2, why does this lead to land sale and harm? When a system is corrupt, it is designed to benefit the elite at the cost of the vulnerable. Selling land does exactly this, as the deal with foreign actors gives money directly into the hands of those in power. Why is this harmful? Because they are corrupt, they have no incentive to reinvest this money into their citizens. They continue holding wealth while the rest of the country suffers from exploitation. So why do we mitigate these harms? When we prohibit the sale of land, these corrupt leaders in power can no longer make easy money through that way. They are then forced to reconsider how they can still make profit using the land. So this will give them a new incentive to focus on improving the systems in their country, to focus on improving agriculture in their country. Why is it that this time citizens will benefit? Even if opposition says that following our logic, corrupt leaders will keep the money, for example, keep taxpayer money to themselves, improvement in infrastructure and, for example, with better roads for transport of agricultural products will still benefit the locals. And now to readdress the point of capacity, why will this give them a further capacity? Because by no longer selling arable land to foreign investors, they will have decreased dependency. So why does this matter? On our side of the house, people finally have a chance to see an improvement. The vulnerable people have a chance to no longer continue their suffering, and therefore very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
Ah yes, corrupt governments will build infrastructures. Guys, have you heard what happened in Serbia? Have you seen what protests are happening there? This is not good analysis. This doesn't benefit anybody, especially not the locals, for who it's even worse. While doing my speech, I'll firstly go through two main clarifications, then I will go through a few clashes that have been happening in this debate and explain through them how we're to this extent still winning and do negation also. Firstly, let's go to the clarifications. One, I want to point out that on the side of the proposition, the developing countries can still sell their land. It's just not this specific land that is fertile for growth of crops. They can still sell land that is not like that. But to note, some countries, developing countries, also have land which is not fertile. I forgot the name of this land, I'm sorry. And secondly, why is this land likely going to be used for food? Is simply because otherwise, those countries that will be buying this land would buy the cheaper land. I think this is intuitive, especially at the point where they give me the whole money incentive as to how I want to have the best profit. Well, yes, I don't want to spend money on something that I don't need. This is why it is likely going to be used for food, and this brings our side exclusive benefits, especially at the point where they point out that this is likely going to be sold to locals. Yes, maybe at a higher price, but guys, at least they have some food that they can buy. At least they have some steady production of food, and they don't have to worry if food is just going to go extinct in their country, and they're not even going to be able to access it. I say rather a bit cheaper, a bit more expensive than no food at all. But now let's go to the clashes. The first one is on the principle clash, because the side of the proposition comes up here and tells me that, oh no, but this doesn't exist in this motion. I tell you, yes, it does. I believe this motion is wrong because it's principally wrong. The principle easily exists here. Now, they do give me some responses to the principle, which is, oh no, but the governments do bad, and also they already have small autonomy. I tell you, yes, they have smaller autonomy. However, why should you limit that smaller autonomy even more? Why would you cut into that even more? By their own analysis, this simply doesn't work. And how do they infringe this principle specifically, and why this is so bad? Is because the country is likely going to decide if this law passes or not. It's likely going to be some international law. For example, the UN. And who has the power in those countries the most? It's the veto countries. It's the countries such as the USA, such as UK, such as Russia, and such as China. These are the countries who did the colonialism. Therefore, you're giving the power back to the colonistic powers that are responsible in the first place for the bad things happening in those corrupted governments. And I tell you this principle is important because even if I decide to sell that land, which on our side is not a guarantee, we can decide not to sell that land, by the way, but if we do sell this land, at least this is my choice. At least I get to decide to do something because I see some clear benefit from it. At least it's not some my colonial ex-power deciding something for me once again, which only amplifies the power of our principle. But now let's look at the point of the exploitation. Because aside the proposition comes up here, and this is their main idea, their main red line of the case, that this causes exploitation. I tell you, this is not inherently exclusive to our side. At the point where they sell other land, at the point where they have mines on their side of the house for resources, the exploitation happens there too. This is not an exclusive mechanism. But now they talk about how they're likely going to use pesticides and going to use bad things on those lands because they want profit. I tell you, if they were going to do that, nobody would buy this. There are high regulations regarding our food. There's high standards that we in the Western world want. So if they want to export that food, they're likely not going to do that. And then they talk about how these workers are underpaid and how they're likely to import workers. I tell you, I'm rather an underpaid worker than not a worker at all. I'd rather get less money than no money at all. Because if I have at least some money, I can still buy food, I can still buy water, I can still buy housing, I can at least still do those things. Because notice how at this point they haven't given me any alternative as to how they actually get out of this cycle. I don't understand how on their side of the house things can actually get progressively better. On our side of the house you at least have some stability of having a job, of having some flow of money that is not going to go away because it is not in the interest of the powers buying this land. And then they tell me how they're going to import the workers. I tell you, yes, they're going to import the more educated workers that they need for the higher positions, but for their lower positions, it's in their incentive to just take the locals because it is a cheaper alternative, because they're a little bit more desperate. Also, you don't have to pay money to import somebody into those countries. But then they also talk about how there is no incentive for these countries buying this land to stay there long term, and they're just going to live. I have two main responses here. The first one is, yes, they do have this incentive. I spend money on that. I want that land to give me a lot of benefit for the long term. I'm likely going to invest in good infrastructure. I'm likely going to invest in good things to keep that land going. For me to have a steady flow of money, they're likely not going to live simply because of that. But even if they leave, I tell you, this is better. If those countries at some point leave, you still are left with the infrastructure that they put there. You're still left with workers who now know how to operate on that land, that know what to do with that land. So it's likely that that land is going to be used in a more beneficial way after they leave. I don't see how this is inherently a bad thing. But now let's look at the alternative of the side of the proposition. Because they come here and tell me that they're going to now have owned companies by the locals. I don't see how those companies can even become to exist. At a point where you have no money, at a point where you have been stuck in this cycle of neo-colonialism, it is not that easy to leave it. There's a reason as to why they go back into why they go back to their ex-colonizers, because they have no other alternatives. They wouldn't be doing this if they didn't necessarily need it for their own survival. They have no means of getting to that point. They have no means of developing that country further because it simply was left in those conditions. They agree with that. But then they tell me that at least on their side of the house, it's going to be stable. I don't understand how. I don't understand why. I tell you, it is more stable when this is a higher, where this is a more developed country who knows how to operate those things because they have been there and they have done that. I tell you, stability also falls on our side of the house. But now let's just quickly look at the short versus the long-term impacts, because the side of the opposition says that we have short-term gains, but they have some long-term benefits slash long-term harms. Look, I tell you, I'd rather have short-term benefits at the point where I can't get anything on the long term. I'd rather constantly have short-term benefits because at least I have some benefits at all. They have zero benefits on their side of the house as to how things get better. However, they only present us the harms. I tell you that I will take the harms, even if everything they say is true. I'm telling you, I would rather take this and accept this and at least have some short-term benefits constantly, because this is the only way I as a country can even become to exist. But then lastly, they talk about corruption and about corrupt leaders, because they're corrupt because of decades of colonialism. Sure, I'm not going to argue with that, but they tell me that they don't reinvest into locals, and on the side of the proposition, they can't make easy money anymore because they don't have those big powers through which they're buying things and doing corruptions. First, I tell you, this is not how corruptions work. For corruption to work, yes, you take some money, but some money still trickles down to people, because you're not just taking money, you're taking money, for one project, you charge more than it's supposed to be, and you take the extra money there is. Some money still trickles down to people, but I tell you that just a corrupt government doing this is way worse, because they have less of an incentive for some stability. They have less of an incentive for something to actually last for a long time, because they're only looking at benefits for them, not what benefits the locals. So I tell you, this is worse on their side of the house, where they don't have some sort of regulations in that case. And with this, they're just cutting into their own case, because at some point they tell me that they are going to do good for the locals, but the corrupt governments are not going to do anything. Look at what happened in Serbia. In Serbia, they built that station and the station collapsed, people were killed. This is likely going to happen in those countries, especially at the point where those countries have even less resources to do anything at all. Because of all those reasons, and because I don't understand what happens then on the side of the proposition, I've never been proud to oppose.
Is the panel ready?
Yeah, we are.
Awesome. In that case, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Opposition cannot claim economy in this debate if they do not refute how economy gets harmed on their side of the house. We give you structural mechanisms on our side of the house, how the economy falters. We give you capacity, we give you incentives. I will continue to characterize them in the clashes, so very proud to be proposing in this debate. A few things. I'll be doing some strategic notes, then move on to my clash on economy, then move on to my political situation, and lastly we'll weigh on vulnerability and intensity. First of all, on the strategic notes. I think they completely mischaracterize developing countries. Like, developing countries do not have an awesome government where like the leaders are going to invest everything into infrastructure that they gain, right? That's simply not true, right? I think, first of all, we can see this, like, especially in like Bolivia, we can see this in Venezuela, we can see this in the majority of like South America, where the governments are so incredibly corrupt, so incredibly authoritarianism, that they do not invest into infrastructure at all, or at least not enough. Why do they not do that? First of all, they're all lobbyists, right? They believe that like they have to benefit themselves first before they can benefit anyone else, right? They want to be rich, they want to be prosperous. We can see this by the palaces that exist from the like the leaders and stuff, but we can see this, no thank you, in comparison to the people that live there, who the majority lives in rural areas which aren't fully developed, which aren't fully like done, right? I'll be continuing like characterizing this later in my clash on political situation. Let's first talk about economy, which I think is the most important clash in this debate, because we are winning on this. First of all, we give you our argument of exploitation. We give you three mechanisms on this. We give you the incentive of foreign companies to exploit, we give you the capacity to exploit, and we give you the impact on country, like the idea of like, the econ harming infringes on economic growth, and the idea of the vicious cycle. Like, I'm going to continue like reconstructing this in my later of my speech. I think they do not respond at all to like the incentive of companies to exploit. So they do admit that these companies are exploiting the people. Mind you, this is really important for later on in the debate in my speech. Now, I think the main thing they tell us is that we don't prove why they have the capacity to invest. I think, first of all, they have capacity. Firstly, especially if we believe that they have gained in economic growth, they do have the capacity to do so, because now they have a lot of money, according to them, and can invest into their own like stuff when this like gets banned. But since we don't believe this, the point is that they do have capacity. 3 structural reasons on this. They have like good, prosperous land, right? Because like why else would foreign companies choose this? But the point is they can use this land for themselves. Now, secondly, why does this work? They do have water. However, what happens with like water and with like the seeds and like other kind of like prosperous things they have, they sell these to foreign companies, which the government does themselves, right? They sell these things because they can gain more money from foreign companies because they're richer, but they can not do this for like people that live there because they don't have like a lot of money to pay for these kind of things. At the point, now thirdly on this, right? Now they have like the incentive to increase capacity on their side of the house, which like meaning like they will make water cheaper because they cannot sell this to anyone else anymore that is currently residing in their country. Now, I think the main refutation they give to this is, well, there's also other land to be exploited. But I think, especially like when we talk about Serbia, when we talk about all these other countries which are like selling land, the most thing they have is this land, right? They have this prosperous land, and that's the majority of those things that they have and that they can use, right? And all the other land, they're likely using for themselves because no one else would buy random land to put things on them if they can do it in their own country, right? Okay, yes, how does this overall just like improve on our side? I've already told you, they have the capacity and the incentive now to like invest into these kind of things, right? The government has the incentive now to actively work on their economy because they do not get any economic gains through other dependencies outside of their own country, right? Another thing they said is that they argue if they have capacity, why would they still sell to foreign powers, right? First of all, because they currently do not have the incentive on their side of the house, because they gain money through this and like don't need the agriculture itself, right? They believe in the short-term idea that they can like continue depending on foreign actors to like sell their land too. Secondly, I think this is like the main point here, right? How is this like different on our side of the house? They cannot do this anymore, so they do not have they might have the incentive to do so, but they don't have the capacity to do so because they're legally not allowed to do so anymore. The point here is now And at the point where they cannot do this anymore, all the other things I recently said on capacity and incentive earlier on in my speech actually become even more relevant because it's now actively happening overall. Now, they bring up the entire idea of economic gains. To address this really quickly, even though I think I've already taken this apart quite a lot. They argue the idea of more economic gains. First of all, why is this unfeasible? First of all, it's not continuous revenue. They never refute this, but the idea is that at the point where you depend so much on foreign countries, you are reliant on them, right? You're reliant on how much they want to buy your land. At a point where your land has been so extremely used, you sold so much to them, they cannot sell this anymore, or maybe the other countries at some point won't want to buy this anymore because it's so incredibly used. At the point where this happens, the economy dies. If they're so incredibly if they're so incredibly dependent on this, they will never be able to do this overall. Yes, please.
Note how even after the colonial power or whatever leaves you, you still have the infrastructure left, you still have people who are educated in this, and now you have the money from what was previously used to buy this land from you to invest it into your infrastructure, except now you have the capacity.
Yes, but that relies on the premise that the government has the incentive to help the people, to build schools, to build education system. The government does not have the incentive to do so because they're just people trying to maximize their own gains. This, sure, can look like Serbia, but the majority of this happens in South America with authoritarian governments, people trying to presidents trying to ruin their own people's lives, right? Okay, I think talking about political situation now, we basically tell you corruption increases. There's been no response on this, but I think they do bring up their own argument in this. They argue, well, governments have the choice to do so. I think at the point where the choice they have actively harms the country itself and the citizens living in them, they shouldn't have the choice to do so. It's stopping me, if I say I have the choice to take drugs, obviously that's awful because this harms myself, right? I think I would have to be stopped for this, the same way governments have to be stopped from doing these detrimental harms, right? The second thing they bring up is well, they know what's best for their country and they like their people, but let's look back at Bolivia, for example. Bolivia has a long history of struggles with the government. We think about the water wars, the war where the government sold their water and agricultural land to a monopole from a different foreign country. What happened there was then that the water prices were so high, they exceeded through the roof, causing incredibly instability within Bolivia, causing an entire war on this, right? People died, millions of children died in this. Panel, this is extremely important. The second thing I bring up is the goal of autonomy. But you cannot have autonomy if you're dependent on foreign actors like the USA, like Russia, like people that are just using to exploit you on this. I think they try to claim colonization on our side of the house, but colonization is happening on their side of the house if we can claim this, right? I think Japan, for example, or even the USA, at the point where they actively buy land on different countries, they're just pushing themselves back into the countries they previously colonized and are just exploiting them again, right? It's not the same as colonization, but if one side is able to claim colonization, we are. Okay, let's weigh this entire thing, right? I think most importantly, we bring up the idea of vulnerability. We believe that the people within are the most vulnerable. They're the ones that get exploited by these evil foreign companies which are actively harming themselves. We have to stop the governments, the authoritarian governments, from taking over those because the people are vulnerable, because the people need a stable economy that they can depend on in the future. The country itself cannot be dependent on someone, if there is that vulnerable, on someone that's a foreign country which does not have the incentive to benefit them at all, which we prove to you in second, which we prove to you in third, and which we prove to you in first. Very proud to be proposing this debate. Thank you.
Assuming everybody's ready. Yes. Panel. Developing countries are not dependent on global superpowers for shits and giggles. They're dependent because they literally have to. They do not have any other options. If they were doing well, if they had the money and the capacity, as the word they like to use it, to invest into their own infrastructure, to be putting this money in, they would be doing that already. At the point of which they cannot do that, the only choice they have left in order to sustain their government, in order to sustain their economy, in order to sustain their citizens, is to sell to somebody else, to give them the opportunity to work and things like that. This is what we're going to be talking about. But firstly then, I want to deal with corrupt leaders and take this completely out of this debate because I think what they paint to you is completely unrealistic and assertive. Secondly then, I'm going to talk about the practical impacts and the tangible impacts for the people on the ground and then the economy itself. Thirdly then, shortly on principle, which is poorly poorly engaged with in this debate, we're taking them out purely on that note. How this is our first argument, they should have engaged with that more. But firstly then, let's talk about the corrupt leaders. Now their second prop tells you that the corruption is really widespread. These countries are very likely corrupt, whatever. I'm not entirely sure they give you analysis as to why, but doesn't matter if they are. We tell you why even corrupt governments will still be doing relatively good for the country, as opposed to what they're proposing. We tell you they do not want that much political backlash. Even if I put my people and give them a factory where they're gonna be maybe like exploited, even though I would tell you mitigations and analysis as to how that's unlikely to happen, we tell you you still want these workers to work and be exploited for you to gain this profit. Meaning you're not gonna not give them anything at all. Meaning you're likely gonna invest something into infrastructure for them. You're gonna likely invest into some buses for them to be able to be transported towards, for example, the job where they're gonna be exploited at, even if we can see that. We tell you that this is something that these governments still want because you still need workers to get the money you want to steal. You could not want people just staying in the middle of the roads and cosplaying French farmers when they get a little less subsidies. Secondly then, we tell you purely on intuitive level, better economy means more money for a corrupt government to steal. I know, sounds silly, right? However, this means that if economy is large, as in country is booming, as in there's more industries within the country, this means that the government itself has more money to steal. Now, sure, they can ask you as to why then stealing this money will still trickle down to people. We tell you that good economy means stable economy. This means that you likely have industries around the world. The way we analyze this now, we tell you that this is through shock resistance. We tell you that even though a bunch of money might be stolen from me and from my taxes or from the things that they make, we tell you at the point of which any other economy that when corrupt government is connected to is going to explode, I still have others to hold on to, which they do not have. This means that I'm shock resistant, which means I do not have spikes in inflation. Meaning I, who am already poorly affording food, means that I, who already can barely afford food, am now more resistant to inflation and can now be less scared of them, which does not happen on their side of the house, when in best case scenario they have one investor, if so. Secondly, let's talk about the fact that they tell you that it's gonna be better on their side of the house long term. They tell you this is not true purely because of the fact they're not proved to us the capacity. We're pro countries being better on their own if they can, except they cannot. Otherwise, this would not be a motion. Not right now. Now, let's talk then about the people on the ground. First point we tell you is about the job. Now, they tell you that these people are going to be exploited. I'm going to talk about this more. But the direct mitigation to the fact about these people are going to have jobs is the fact that these are likely going to be imported workers. Except it doesn't work with their own analysis of profit incentive. As in to say, an imported worker from, say, Germany is likely, or Slovenia, not to point anybody out, is likely to demand higher pay, meaning that you're only going to import workers that are necessary for that to work, as in maybe higher educated somebody who you cannot educate on the ground in, say, Democratic Republic of Congo or anything else you can think of. What this then means is that this still opens a bunch of jobs for other people on the ground. Now note how this is not contingent on the fact be that used for agriculture or not. Even if it's industries such as cod produce or whatever, or you want to make iPhones in Congo because of cobalt, this means that there's still going to be jobs for people on the ground, and we tell you this is good. Now the analysis they give you is they say that this is exploitation, as in foreign for profit and all of these things. We have three responses to this. First two are mitigations, sure, but they still stand. One, we saw there's a bunch of regulations within the UN that prohibit these things from happening. They have things to do with this. Second of all, we tell you that people usually like to boycott stuff that is made unhumanely. That's the reason why Shein is losing in on profits, is because people do not believe in buying from something that actively exploits people. This is why they're likely to give in, at least into some of the demands of either international community of people on the ground, because they want to still manage the profits, right? They're going to try to balance it out and get some kind of benefits for people on the ground and yet get the profit. We tell you this is still good and not as harmful as they claim. But third of all, we tell you that on the agricultural sectors that they claim, we tell you that people, most countries are not allowed to sell anything with pesticides in it. You will not go into in German supermarket and see something contained with pesticides in it. What means that the exploitative companies do not have a market to export to with things that they have. What this means is that they're likely to use less damaging things from this. But we tell you that even all of this isn't true. We tell you these people have a choice to do so. They have a choice to opt into being not so well off, or being dead and having a dead child and a dead cat and a dead dog and a dead mouse in a house. We tell you this, we tell you this is bad. We tell you want people to have a choice. It's not that everybody's chaining them into these factories. We tell you if people don't want to die of hunger, they will. And this is the alternative on their side of the house, because up to this point they have not proven to me as to where this money actually comes from, especially if governments are to some extent corrupt. Secondly then, let's talk under this about the whole idea about infrastructure. No, they tell you that there's no incentive for local governments to build infrastructure because they're corrupt. We tell you yes, but this was not their analysis. We tell you that the countries and the companies that are building and buying this land are the ones that are building. The US, when it bought the canal and had the canal in their power, was the one that built the entire city around around the Panama Canal. I was there. It's kind of silly, but still, point is, it's those countries, those governments that want to take care of it. It's those governments that are going to build ports and build roads and things like that, and even potentially even healthcare for the sake of their workers being well off, especially the posh British ones. They'll tell you that this means that there's still going to be some more access and some better infrastructure is going to be trickled down. And note how this is then. This happens in our side of the house. Even if the worst case scenario happens, because even if these companies are like your ex and use you and leave you, they're still gonna leave down, instead of mental issues, they're gonna leave down infrastructure, they're gonna leave behind ports, and they're gonna leave behind roads. We tell you this is good, this trickles down to people. Now, Now, second of all, their entire case contingents on the fact that all of these things are going to be exploitative. As if to say, they assert that exploitation is bad, which I don't know, in vacuum works, except that if the alternative is that, then maybe you should get something more. But this is the entire premise of their case, because their second argument already took with my first speech. Now, we tell you, now let's move on to the principal part of this case. Now, the proper response we get from third prop is that if your actions harm the entire country, then you should not have the right to autonomy, you should not have the right to choose, as in, for example, drugs. Except the drug dollars were the only thing that saved the US in that crisis. Just because I smoke and because I'm likely going to be overburdening my healthcare system with my lung cancer in like 10 years in the future, doesn't mean I do not have the right to opt into smoking. It doesn't mean that this country is not going to think so. But even more so, we tell you that these countries are even more likely so to benefit from it. And lastly, they never respond to the fact about they don't respond properly to the principal part of this argument, when we tell you it's they're the ones who are going to suffer the consequences of their action, hence they're the ones who should choose what to do. Thank you.
Even though Alia just stole my reply intro, I'm still going to tell you it just because I think it really proves the point. I smoke. I can see on every box of cigarettes that I buy that this causes cancer and is likely going to kill me. But guess what? I decide to weigh the benefits and the harms that this proposes to me, and I decide to do it anyway. This is an action that is going to impact me and me only. This is where the principal idea that we have been pushing throughout this entire debate comes from, and this is why the principle exists. We can see that in today's society already, we value this principle really highly, at the point where people still are allowed to smoke, at the point where people are allowed to consume alcohol, at the point where people are allowed to do bad actions. This is a principle that we highly value in our society. What I'm going to do in my reply speech, I'm going to go through a few strategic mistakes of the side of the proposition, and then present to you their best case scenario and our worst case scenario, and tell you how we still win this debate. The first strategic mistake is that they talk about corrupt governments, but then they decide they're going to have some big impact in the long term about how things are suddenly going to be better on their side of the house. I don't understand how this works. They have never proven me links between those things and how things are actually going to get better, rather than just those corrupt governments wanting to get more money. I don't understand how they're going to get more money, because they simply don't have the capacity to do so. Secondly, they tell me that all of the money from those from this sold crops go out of the country, but suddenly when this is lost, the dictator or the corrupt government loses the easy money, and they're going to go to another alternative. I don't understand how this works. They can't exist together. Thirdly, they live in some sort of a debate land where everything goes perfectly down on their side of the house, where those countries who have been colonized, who literally have no other alternatives, this is why they're going back to their colonizers, are now suddenly going to be better off, and everything is going to be sunshines and rainbows. This is simply not how it's going to work. They need to step down and be a bit more realistic. But now let's look at their best case scenario and tell you how we still win. In their best case scenario, people do not get exploited by foreigners anymore, and corrupt governments have the capacity to do good. What I tell you here is that if they're not going to be exploited by foreigners, they're going to be exploited by their corrupt governments who want as much money as they can for themselves. This is literally their words, not mine. They're going to just be exploited by their own government, which I don't see how this is comparatively better. Secondly, I tell you that governments on a comparative to like foreigners are going to do everything more poorly because they just want to get it done so they can say, oh look, I did something and keep all the rest of the money. But in the interest of foreigners who have the money to do so are likely going to build better infrastructure because they simply have the capacity to do so, and they don't want to spend more money later on. This is why likely things like infrastructure are going to be better on our side of the house because we're not going to repeat the mistakes that happened in Serbia. And thirdly, I tell you that even if all that they say is true, I tell you that it's still principally wrong. You still take a choice away from a country that has been oppressed throughout history for a very long time. I tell you that this is still principally wrong, and even just on a principle, we're able to win this debate. And even with our worst case scenario, where people are so exploited and everything is so horrible, and we're stuck in the cycle, I tell you that at least we get quality infrastructure because it is in the incentive of those investors. But secondly, I tell you that people get jobs. People get at least some sort of money, even if they're underpaid. People at least have something to do. People at least have connections to their workplace, and they're at least able to do something. At least they're able to get jobs. At least they're able to afford food. At least they're able to do some of that. I don't understand how any of this is better than the proposition, especially when they don't actually prove to me the links, how things get better on their side of the house, how they get some long-term impacts, because I rather take short-term benefits than the risk of not even having long-term benefits that I try to talk about. But also the magnitude of the harm in comparison to the benefit is really big because those people literally have nothing. I want to rather give them jobs and risk them still being dependent on somebody else rather than just leave them with no jobs and leave them to die in their own countries. Because of all those reasons, please vote side opposition.
Okay, if the panel is ready, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition loses debate at the point where in second speech they bring the burden on themselves to prove why companies are likely to help infrastructure and why they wouldn't care about profit in this case, and then in their entire case try and use this as their only and main impact. This is the point where we take this debate. In this reply, I'm going to give you 3 main things, Pat. First of all, some strategic notes we see on strategic flaws we see on their side of the house. Then a clash on like what exactly selling land leads to, which was mainly what this debate was about. And finally, what we then do end up taking this debate. Let's start off with some of their strategic flaws. In their second or third speech, in the second speech, it tells a few different things. First of all, they start off by telling us that developing countries only have arable land. Then they tell us that they can sell other land that is not arable. Then they go on to say that they can sell arable land to companies and then grow crops on non-arable land. I think this entire thing's just full of contradictions. They aren't able to decide how much the arable land do developing countries have. They aren't able to decide what arable land is. They mischaracterize this. And then another flaw is half of their most important analysis comes in their third opposition and reply. I think you have to know, panel, this comes way too late in the debate. We have no opportunity to engage this. We have no opportunity to say any of this. And then the last main strategic thing is they don't seem to understand this is a this house believes that motion. We're not forcing anything upon the countries. But let's say we are forcing something upon them. There's still, as our third explained to you, there's still no autonomy on their side of the house because they concede that dependency does exist, and at this point they still have to rely on other countries to sell this land to. So even if we give them the point that we don't have autonomy, they don't have this either. So this just becomes irrelevant in the context of the debate. Okay, moving on to the clash on what selling land will actually lead to. Let's start off. What do they tell you? They tell you that companies who buy land are likely to ensure, for example, that their employees are healthy because they need this if they actually want them to work. They tell us that companies will build infrastructure like streets, hospitals because they want efficiency. But where do they then fail? They don't prove to us A, why efficiency increases, and they don't prove to us B, why the profit incentive of the company doesn't exist anymore, and why companies would just suddenly feel like, oh yes, I'm going to now help these people, I just feel like it. We give you analysis on why profit incentive exists in our first prop. They still haven't responded to that at this point, which means their entire impact on proving why companies have an incentive to build infrastructure already falls. Now, moving on, what do we give you in this debate? We tell you that dependency leads to a lack of development because like the only income they can get is through selling, and they're stuck in an infinite cycle. We also tell you that the land that is sold is used in bad ways, and so at the end of this day, like we proved to you how they're stuck in a cycle, and we proved to you why companies use land in a way that harms. Now they don't refute this often. They just like say something about how pesticides won't actually be used, but even at that point, we still give you analysis on, for example, how factories are bad and how this has bad impact on the people. We have an entire first prop talking about all these impacts, which they don't mainly refute. So now at the end of this debate, we have the impact of land being used in a bad way standing, and they also agree that dependency exists in this debate. So we also still have our impact on why a cycle stays. But now the problem is their only impact, if we take them at their best, is that the foreign companies will build infrastructure. But like I think we already respond to this to you in many ways. I mean, we tell you why there's a profit incentive. We tell you why companies put themselves first. So even their only impact that is left fails because they try to prove us a burden why companies don't care as much about profit. So at the end of the day, I think it's clear we do end up taking this debate. We end up with more impacts. We end up proving why their impacts don't stand. I think this is a clear win for us. So proud to propose. Thank you for listening.